Right.
all the way from University of St. Andrews. And
Yeah, so this is a double act. I've promised Francisco that I can do this bit in 6 minutes, so we'll see how that goes.
go law.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about intragenomic conflict and take a first principles approach to form a general definition of intragenomic conflict and look at its different types. Right, so we're here to talk about conflict. Conflict sort of applies that we have agents with agendas. When the agendas of different agents are not aligned with each other, that gives us conflict. So if we're thinking about intragenomic conflicts, those are situations where our agents are genes with their own agendas. So I'm going to give the first part of the talk, focusing on agents and agendas and what that means in a gene context. And so this is very much based on a paper I wrote 15 years ago now with John Welsh. And I'm going to hand over to Francisco, who'll talk about a paper that we published in 2017, The Meaning of Intragenomic Conflict in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. Okay, so yesterday in Jeff's tutorial, we heard about the individual as maximizing agent analogy and how the idea of individuals striving to maximize their fitness is a super powerful tool that we can use in evolutionary biology. I've got a little picture of a creature here. There's a spider that's a bit difficult to see munching on a fly. The adaptations of the spider, including its camouflage, are all sort of working towards maximizing that spider's fitness. And it's a very useful way of thinking about living organisms. The idea of the individual as a fitness maximizing agent was really nicely articulated by Alan Graffin in a really landmark paper in 2002 that if you're not familiar with this, you need to go and have a look at this paper. He first of all formalized the idea of individuals maximizing their fitness using these kind of objects, optimization programs from optimization theory. And this is basically just saying the individual is using its phenotype. Oh, that's bright. Phenotype to maximize its fitness within the constraints of its, the possible set of phenotypes. And this sort of formal structure allows us to formally define notions of optimality. Writing the structure down doesn't commit us to the idea that individuals are behaving optimally. It's more telling us what their goal is. It's like the goal rather than the realization of that goal. And so we can, in this kind of object, capture the idea of an individual striving towards something. And then Alan provided formal justification for looking at organisms in that way by showing that there are strong mathematical correspondences between this optimization object and a price equation description of the dynamics of natural selection. So in kind of brief terms, if we think about individuals as striving to maximize their fitness, that in a way is an alternative but equivalent way of thinking about the dynamics of natural selection. It's a valid way of thinking about how natural selection is working. In Jeff's tutorial yesterday, we heard about inclusive fitness. In the context of interactions between genetic relatives, individuals don't appear to maximize their personal fitness, but rather their inclusive fitness. And Alan's first paper that I just showed had assumed no social interactions between relatives, but he followed it up a few years later with very similar analysis where he generalized to allow for that. And he showed that if we now think about the individuals as striving to maximize their inclusive fitness, that recovers this connection with the dynamics of natural selection. So he provided formal justification for thinking of individuals as inclusive fitness maximizers. So I've been very interested in Alan's approach here, and I've applied it at other levels of biological organization. So to look at, when can we think of social groups, colonies, as being organisms in their own right, fitness maximizers? That is justified in some very limited circumstances. These kind of unusual creatures here is not generally justified. The paper with John is going down to the gene level and thinking about fitness maximization there. I want to be very clear about what what I mean by a gene when I talk about genes is fitness maximizers. So the little picture here shows if we look in a cell at two homologous chromosomes, so there's one from the mother, one from the father. We're looking at two loci here. At locus 1, the top locus, the individual is homozygous at that locus. There is one allele that is carried in both of the homologous chromosomes. And if we look at the second locus, the individual is heterozygous. There's two alleles there. So just to be really clear, we're looking at two loci, three alleles, and four genes. The gene is different. It's a different thing from the allele. They're conceptually different. The allele is like the categorical type. The gene is the concrete token. And it's the gene, the token, that we're going to identify as the agent here. And this is crucial because in Jason's tutorial yesterday, we heard about conflicts between an individual's maternal origin genes and their paternal origin genes. Genes have parent of origin, but alleles do not. The allele will in some cases be maternally have originated from the mother and sometimes from the father. If we want to think about genes in conflict, this is how we need to think about them. And yeah, to kind of cut to the chase, if we think about genes in this way, they're really like miniature organisms. So for exactly the same logic as in Alan's work on inclusive fitness, we can think of genes as striving to maximize their inclusive fitness. They interact socially with other genes. Some of these genes, they have some degree of identity by descent. They will act as if they're striving to maximize their inclusive fitness. So we can write this down with an optimization program capturing this idea, the gene using its phenotype to maximize its inclusive fitness, and show that that mathematically corresponds to a description of natural selection pitched at the gene level. So I just want to kind of finish with the idea that genes are inclusive fitness maximizers. They don't necessarily have to behave selfishly. They can behave in mutually beneficial ways and altruistic ways, spiteful ways. And importantly, they can be favored to do that if it increases their inclusive fitness. Right, I'm going to hand over to Francisco now.
I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, so like Anders, Harvey, and Martin, for inviting me. I just taking over like Andy, and then basically I want to introduce basically what was intragenomic conflict and link it to previous presentations. So intragenomic conflict is very close to my heart. It's basically what I was doing my PhD on. And basically one of the frustrations when you go into intragenomic conflict or you talk about conflict is basically like you ask yourself, what is intragenomic conflict or what is conflict? And the answer is we don't know, basically. You have to go, well, back in time, you go to the library and you start like searching for like really old papers like Kutzmides and Tooby. And then basically you go into like more recent papers like Kasha, Warren, and Rice. And then you find that basically the definition that they provide, made an attempt, they provide a definition, but basically they're excluding things that we consider they are intragenomic conflict, like any parent of origin effects, anything like genomic imprinting is not included in that definition. Then you go to like the seminal paper of Graf Alan in 2006 that Andy was mentioning. And then basically he provides a definition of intragenomic conflict, which does the opposite thing. He excludes anything that is meiotic derived alike. So there is not a definition of intragenomic conflict that encompasses what quite a lot of scientists think is intragenomic. What do we think that is intragenomic conflict? So the seminal book of Genes in Conflict by Bertson Trivers provides an amazing catalog of like all the different things that in the field we actually consider is intragenomic conflict. It is a catalog, but they don't provide a definition. I'm not saying that. That was basically the review of like Charlesworth, Alan himself, like they both actually, and you read the book, there is not a forward definition of like basically what is intragenomic conflict. What do I understand by intragenomic conflict? And in the absence of one definition, becomes very difficult to like have a field in which basically we can understand each other. So, and not only is basically we can communicate with each other, there's also the problem that the drivers of this conflict actually remain obscure until we actually can provide a definition in which we all agree that is the definition of conflict. This is where I want to like link to previous research. and in particular, basically, to the presenter of Jeff Wild and Manus Patent yesterday. I will be using yours because it's a landmark picture with lots of interpretations. So following like on the steps of Jeff, then basically I use a quote of Chief Brody. You're going to ignore this particular problem until it swims up and bites you on the ass. I'm not reenacting as good as Jeff does, but my acting skills are limited. So basically, so it's not until we actually are able to provide a definition of intragenomic conflict that we will be able to progress. So we try to do that, and we provide a definition that is very simple. Actually, comes from stems from the idea of agenda, an agency that Andy introduced. So intragenomic conflict occurs when two different genes resided in the same genome. They have different agendas, and Andy has already established what is the connection between agendas and dynamic systems. So we have this little gene, gene A in here, is trying to scrap of nucleic acid, and is trying to do something that is basically maximize its inclusive fitness using a particular phenotype with a strategy from a set of strategies. That is what it's trying to do, is maximizing this inclusive fitness subject to a set of strategies that is available to gene A. So what we do is like, what we say, like, okay, well, let's give control of a particular phenotype to that particular gene. So if we give control, hypothetically, give control of that particular phenotype to gene A, what happens is has an impact on its inclusive fitness, changes inclusive fitness, which will be given by the summation of the impact on, or like the change in the reproductive success of all the social partners is interacting with, multiply by the relatedness or the valuation place of that particular gene on the social partners. The two components, impact in the reproductive success and the relatedness valuation. So when inclusive fitness consequence of a particular phenotype change is positive for one particular gene, but is negative for another gene, there is a conflict between these genes, and the phenotype will be pulled in different directions. So they will select it to change. Therefore, the ultimate source of conflict lies in different genes residing in the same genome, having different inclusive fitness agendas. And that actually links to the talk of Manus and buckets, basically. So here we have different buckets, and he was indicating that how there's different ways of classifying. I want to highlight that basically the intention of our paper was not providing a classification, was actually providing a definition. And then in using this definition, showing that this definition actually works, we actually use that definition to classify the different phenomena that Burton Trivers had indicated were part of this field. So you can see that basically from this simple change in inclusive fitness of gene A, there will be two components that can change the inclusive fitness, or like there could be two reasons why gene A and gene B may have different agendas. One is because they actually differ, gene A and B, they don't agree on the impact upon the reproductive success of its social partners. The second one, or the second possibility, is that they disagree on the valuation on the relatedness to social partners. There's only two ways in which basically these agendas can disagree, because those two are different for the two different genes. So extrapolating that, then looking at, then we can classify the conflict into three different types. Am I running out of time?
Very good.
Okay. So we have origin conflict, which is basically the two different genes disagree on the relatedness, but in relatedness in terms of like where they actually came from. Okay. And that could explain the classical case of parent of origin conflict between genes that are maternally inherited or paternally inherited, or genomic imprinting. The second type of conflict would be destination conflict, is again, the two genes disagree in the evaluation of relatedness to social partners, but this time they disagree in the probability or the likeliness that they will be present in future generations. And that explains the paradigmatic case of intragenomic conflict of meiotic drive. So in this particular case, they disagree on how likely they are present in the future generations, and they go into conflict. So the definition is able to bring together those two paradigmatic cases that previously seems to be disjoint. And then finally, we have the situation conflict when it's qualitatively different, is the case in which basically the genes disagree about the probability of being a particular carrier, and because they disagree in the probability of being a particular carrier, they disagree on the impact on the fitness of its partners. And that could be, that is the case, that's the disagreement observed in the case of green beard genes. So as such, what we did is basically then we went over, now we took the buckets, and then we went over like the different cases of the different types of genetic elements, imprinted genes, cytoplasmic elements, sex chromosome genes, and then we classify them as part of an origin conflict, a destination conflict, and a situation conflict, which is more like a social structure. And then showing to some extent that that definition works for the kind of phenomena or events and that at that time were relevant. Of course, going back and try to close down with Jaws, Chief Brody says, like basically just before firing the shot to our friend, says, "Smile, you son of a bitch." So this is not the last word. There's always new events that may require a revision of the definition of intragenomic conflict. But I think so far, at least we have a working definition that I think could apply to most of the cases of intragenomic conflict that we know, and can bring a little bit of structure to that field. And that's all.